June 4, 2023, the sound of the firearm's deafening crack echoed through the dimly lit room, followed by an eerie silence. Jovar Jackson stood over the body of Terell Douglas, her breath coming in short, jagged bursts, eyes wide with disbelief. The man who had been the father of her unborn child, the man she had once loved with all the intensity of her youthful heart, lay motionless at her feet. His blood seeped slowly into the carpeted floor, painting a dark crimson stain that matched the storm in her chest. In her trembling hands, the firearm still smoked faintly, a silent witness to the tragedy unfolding. Was this a moment of self-defense, an instinctive reaction to an unanticipated threat, or had something darker led her to pull the trigger, an act of vengeance, driven by weeks, months, or perhaps years of emotional torment? The truth was now lost in the silence of her empty apartment, with only the oppressive weight of her actions and the lifeless body at her feet to bear witness. Jovar had been through so much in her life, and yet, this moment was unlike anything she could have ever imagined. As a deputy for the Rockdale County Sheriff's Office, she had once been admired, a rising star in the department, respected by colleagues, and trusted by her superiors. But here she stood, a woman shattered by her own decisions, looking down at the man who had once been the love of her life. It had started years ago, in the unlikeliest of places. Jovar had always prided herself on her strength, her discipline, and her unwavering commitment to serving the community. She was a woman who lived by the rules, who had spent years working her way up the ranks, proving herself to be more than capable. By 2019, she had earned her promotion to a jail training officer and later became a school resource officer. Her career was on the rise. Everything she had worked for seemed to fall perfectly into place. Yet, underneath her professional demeanor, something darker had been brewing. It was Terell Douglas, a man with a criminal past, who entered her life at a time when she least expected it. He was the type of man her colleagues warned her about, the type who seemed to carry with him a storm of trouble wherever he went. But there was something about him, something magnetic, that drew Jovar in. Perhaps it was the way he made her feel alive, or maybe it was the forbidden thrill of loving someone who seemed so far removed from her world of law enforcement and order. At first, their relationship was a secret, hidden from prying eyes. Jovar was careful, so careful, not to let her personal life interfere with her work. But secrets, as they often do, had a way of unraveling. Slowly, her colleagues began to notice, whispers started to spread, and soon, her supervisors caught wind of the growing relationship. It wasn't just the relationship itself that raised concern, it was the fact that Terell's criminal record stood in stark contrast to everything Jovar had ever represented. In 2019, after an internal investigation, Jovar was reprimanded for her involvement with Terell. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was a warning. The department had made it clear that such entanglements could not only jeopardize her career but could also undermine the trust and respect she had earned within the force. But despite the warnings, despite the reprimands, Jovar remained committed to Terell. Her feelings for him had grown deeper, more intense, and despite the consequences, she chose him over the career she had worked so hard to build. The weeks that followed saw her struggle to balance the conflicting forces in her life. Her colleagues, who had once admired her, began to view her with suspicion. The law enforcement world is a world that demands integrity, loyalty, and a commitment to the greater good, values that Jovar had always upheld. But with Terell in her life, the lines between right and wrong, between loyalty to her career and loyalty to her heart, began to blur. The tension was palpable, and it was clear to everyone around her that she was walking a dangerous path. Despite the growing pressure, Jovar's career seemed to thrive. She was promoted again, this time to corporal. But on the inside, she felt the strain of her divided life. The weight of the choices she had made, the tension between her personal and professional worlds, threatened to pull her apart. She had been raised with the belief that hard work and dedication would bring her success, but now, with Terell's shadow hanging over her, she was starting to question everything she had worked for. By the end of 2022, Jovar's life had become a delicate balancing act. Her pregnancy, the result of a rocky relationship with Terell, only added to the emotional chaos. The reality of impending motherhood loomed over her, but so did the growing realization that her relationship with Terell was unraveling. He had become distant, cold, and the rumors of his infidelity had begun to surface. It was as though the life she had once dreamed of was slipping through her fingers, and the man who had been the center of her world no longer seemed to care. The strain on Jovar was immense. She had given up so much for him, her career, her reputation, and now, her heart. In those quiet moments, when she would lie awake at night, alone in the darkness of her thoughts, she wondered if it had all been worth it. Was it worth the price she had paid? And more importantly, would the future she had once dreamed of ever come to fruition? In the spring of 2023, just a few short months before the fatal confrontation, Jovar made the decision that would change everything. She would leave the sheriff's office. The stress, the strain, the constant juggling between her professional responsibilities and her personal life had taken its toll. She was emotionally and physically drained, and the thought of continuing in the department, under the intense scrutiny, had become unbearable. But leaving the job didn't mean leaving her problems behind. The emotional turmoil she felt only deepened, especially with the growing sense of betrayal and abandonment. Terell's distance from her became more pronounced, and the rumors surrounding his infidelity gnawed at her, consuming her from the inside out. And yet, she could not bring herself to leave him. She still loved him, in spite of everything. This emotional spiral, this whirlwind of doubt, guilt, and fear, set the stage for the tragic events that would unfold on June 4, 2023. In the days leading up to that moment, Jovar felt increasingly isolated. The relationship, which had once filled her with passion and hope, had turned toxic. And as her pregnancy progressed, the sense of betrayal only grew stronger, until it became an unbearable weight that crushed her spirit. As Jovar Jackson stepped into the sterile office of the Rockdale County Sheriff's Office on the morning of June 4, 2023, she barely recognized the woman who had once walked through these doors full of confidence and promise. Her uniform fit her as it always had, crisp and neat, but there was something about her posture that had shifted. It wasn't the physical weight of pregnancy that made her shoulders sag. It was the weight of her decisions, of the disillusionment that had taken root deep in her heart, gnawing away at her from the inside out. The once hopeful deputy, who had ascended through the ranks with so much drive and purpose, now found herself consumed by uncertainty and regret. The culmination of years of emotional turmoil and personal strife was closing in on her. Every glance she received from her colleagues carried an unspoken judgment, every whispered conversation behind her back a reminder of what she had become, a woman who had chosen a man with a criminal history over the career she had worked so hard to build. A woman who, in the end, seemed to have lost everything, her job, her pride, and her peace of mind. But that wasn't the full story. The story was more complicated than that. Jovar had always believed in redemption. Her job had taught her that people could change, that mistakes could be corrected, and that everyone deserved a second chance. She had seen it countless times in the faces of the inmates she had trained and the students she had mentored. She knew that people, like her, weren't defined by their pasts, but by the decisions they made moving forward. Terell Douglas, the father of her child, had shown her his best side at first, charming, affectionate, and seemingly remorseful of his past mistakes. She had believed in him, or at least, she had wanted to. When she first met him, there had been a spark, a connection so powerful, so magnetic, that it made her feel invincible. She was young, in love, and in the most basic of human ways, she wanted to believe in the good in people. But as their relationship grew, the reality of who Terell was began to chip away at the facade. And yet, no matter how many times he disappointed her, no matter how many lies he told, Jovar stayed. She stayed for the moments when he would hold her hand and promise that things would get better. She stayed because she had convinced herself that love could overcome anything. As 2022 came to a close, Jovar felt herself becoming more and more disconnected from the woman she had once been. Terell's actions had caused her deep emotional pain, but her loyalty to him, to their unborn child, kept her from fully confronting the situation. She had always been a fighter, always believed that giving up was not an option, but now, she felt like a woman on the edge, caught between two worlds, the life she had built in law enforcement, and the man who was slowly destroying her, piece by piece. Their relationship was like walking a tightrope, every step fraught with tension. Terell had become distant, the promises of change growing fainter with each passing day. The rumors about his infidelity didn't help the situation. Jovar heard whispers at work, people who had once called her a friend now looked at her with pity. They saw the cracks forming, but they didn't know the half of it. They didn't know that she was carrying not just a child, but a burden so heavy that it had started to crush her spirit. They didn't know that she was trying to balance the impossible, her career and her chaotic, painful relationship with Terell. By early 2023, Jovar's professional life was hanging by a thread. Despite her promotion to corporal, the strain of her personal life had begun to show. Her performance at work, which had once been impeccable, now seemed to falter. She would arrive late, distracted, her mind constantly drifting to Terell's increasingly erratic behavior. At times, she felt like a stranger to herself, unable to reconcile the woman in uniform with the broken woman at home. The whispers and the rumors were starting to escalate. Her supervisors were becoming more and more concerned about her state of mind, but Jovar had become a master at hiding her pain. She would smile and pretend everything was fine, even as her insides twisted with the suffocating weight of her choices. But deep down, she knew she couldn't keep up the facade forever. Her colleagues had begun to avoid her, and the isolation she felt in her personal life mirrored the loneliness she now experienced at work. Her decision to stay with Terell had not been an easy one. She had known the risks, known that the relationship could destroy her career, but she had clung to the hope that he would change. She believed in the man he could become, not the man he had been. And every time he promised that things would get better, she wanted to believe him. She wanted to be the person who could help him find redemption, who could show him that love could heal the deepest wounds. But now, with the pressure mounting from all sides, Jovar found herself questioning everything. The life she had dreamed of, a career in law enforcement, a family with Terell, a future she could build, was slipping through her fingers. Each passing day brought a new wave of doubts, a new betrayal to contend with. Terell's infidelity, his emotional distance, the rumors swirling around her, everything had become too much. The morning of June 4, 2023, was a culmination of everything Jovar had been holding in for so long. Her pregnancy had been a source of both joy and dread. She had always wanted to be a mother, but now, with Terell's behavior spiraling out of control, she wasn't sure she was ready for the responsibility. She wasn't sure she could do it alone. And yet, every time she looked at her belly, she knew that this child, this innocent life, was the one thing that tied her to him, for better or for worse. The confrontation with Terell was inevitable. They had been avoiding each other for weeks, the tension palpable, but on that day, it all came to a head. The moment they faced each other in the apartment was a powder keg, ready to explode. He had come over, seemingly to talk, but there was no resolution to be found in their words. His indifference, his coldness, cut deeper than any of his past actions had. She had loved him so fiercely, given him everything, and now, in the cold light of reality, it felt as if he had never truly cared for her at all. He had abandoned her emotionally, and she could feel the finality of it. In that moment, something inside Jovar snapped. The years of emotional betrayal, the hopelessness, the isolation, and the unbearable pressure came crashing down on her. Her hands trembled as she reached for the gun, the one thing that had always been part of her law enforcement training but never something she had imagined using outside of that context. The decision was made in an instant, driven by a mix of anger, heartbreak, and the crushing weight of everything that had led to this point. It was over. For her, for Terell, and for the life they could have had. But what happened next would forever be etched into her soul. The apartment was eerily silent as Jovar stood in the center of the room, her mind racing. Terell had walked in just moments ago, his face unreadable, his presence both familiar and foreign at the same time. He had come to talk, or so he claimed. But there was no conversation left to have. Their relationship, once filled with passion and promise, had been reduced to ashes. Each word exchanged only seemed to drive a deeper wedge between them, and the emotions that had been simmering for months, anger, betrayal, hopelessness, finally erupted in an uncontrollable wave. Jovar could feel her heart hammering in her chest, the overwhelming sense of loss suffocating her. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the small revolver in her hand, the cold metal a stark contrast to the heat of her emotions. The gun had always been a tool of protection for her, a part of her uniform, something she used to defend others. But now, in this moment, it felt like a symbol of everything she had lost. It was her only means of control, the only thing she could use to make Terell understand the depth of her pain, her frustration. Terell had never been one for serious conversations. He wasn't here to apologize, not truly. He had become distant, withdrawn, as if she were a stranger to him, someone he no longer had to care for. She had known about the rumors, heard whispers from her colleagues, seen the late nights and the half-hearted explanations. But nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. Nothing could have prepared her for the coldness in his eyes when he looked at her now, the woman who had stood by him through everything, who had sacrificed her career, her reputation, and her heart. "Jovar," Terell said, his voice flat. "You need to get your head straight. I'm done with all this. I'm done with you." The words hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment, she could barely breathe. "Done?" she repeated, her voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and hurt. "After everything? After all we've been through, you're just done?" His gaze didn't falter. "Yeah. Done. I never wanted to be tied down. You knew that. You knew what I was about when you started this whole thing with me. You knew I wasn't the kind of man you could build a future with." Jovar's pulse quickened as her emotions spiraled out of control. He had always known how to twist the knife deeper, to make her feel like she wasn't enough, like she had made a mistake by loving him. But this was too much. It was the final betrayal, the ultimate confirmation that nothing she had done mattered. All the sacrifices she had made, her career, her dreams, her sense of self, had meant nothing to him. "You don't get to do this," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. "You don't get to just walk away like it's nothing. I gave you everything. Everything." Terell's face hardened. "I never asked you for any of that. You did it because you thought you could change me. But I'm not changing. This is who I am. Deal with it." Jovar felt a surge of frustration and anger building inside her, a torrent of emotions she could no longer control. The weight of his words, his indifference, crushed her. She had been the one to give, to love, to believe that they could overcome the odds. And now, she was left with nothing but an empty shell of a man who had never truly cared for her, never truly been loyal. "Leave," she whispered, her voice raw with pain. She had to get him out, had to end it, because if she didn't, she feared she would lose herself completely. But Terell didn't leave. Instead, he took a step closer to her, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're going to control me? You think you can just kick me out like I'm some nobody?" Jovar's breath came faster now, her body trembling with the weight of her emotions. She wanted to push him away, to scream, to do anything that would make him understand. But in that moment, the air between them felt charged, electric. The pain was too much, the years of emotional turmoil too deep. It was as though everything she had tried to suppress, every feeling of betrayal, every doubt, every fear, had finally exploded. Her hand was shaking as she gripped the gun, the cold metal pressing into her palm. She didn't want to use it. She didn't want to hurt him. But in that instant, it was as if her body moved without her consent, a response to the overwhelming torrent of emotions that had been building for so long. The world around her seemed to blur, the edges of reality fading as the confrontation escalated. "I don't need you," she spat, her voice breaking. "I never needed you. But I let you into my life, into my heart, and this is how you repay me?" Terell took another step forward, his face hardening with defiance. "You think you can control me? You're pathetic, Jovar." The words stung. They were the final insult, the breaking point. Her heart pounded in her chest as she lifted the gun, her finger trembling on the trigger. The weight of what she was about to do settled over her like a dark cloud. But the words, the betrayal, the emptiness she felt in her soul, overpowered everything else. She had given him everything, and now he was walking away without a second thought. And in that instant, everything snapped. The shot rang out, loud and final. The noise was deafening in the small apartment, the sound of metal striking the air like a crack of thunder. Terell's body jerked slightly, the shock of the bullet hitting him too quick for him to react. He collapsed onto the floor, his eyes wide in disbelief. Jovar stood frozen, the gun still in her hand, her entire body numb. The world seemed to slow as she stared at him, the man who had once been her world, now lying lifeless before her. For a moment, time itself stood still. The reality of what she had just done washed over her in waves. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her mind raced as she tried to process what had happened. Was it self-defense? Was it revenge? Or was it a moment of sheer desperation, a breaking point after months of emotional chaos? The truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was the aftermath, the consequences of her actions. She had taken a life, and in doing so, she had sealed her own fate. The weight of the decision, the burden of what she had done, pressed heavily on her chest. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor beside his body, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she tried to comprehend the magnitude of the moment. But it was too late for regret. It was too late for anything. The past could never be undone. And now, all she had left was the silence, the haunting stillness of the room, and the life that would never be the same again. The room was suffocating. Time had frozen the moment Jovar pulled the trigger, the consequences of that single act hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Terell's body lay motionless, a stark reminder of everything she had lost and everything she had destroyed in a matter of seconds. The weight of the gun in her trembling hands felt both foreign and inevitable, as though it had always been destined to end this way. The rush of adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation now left her empty, numb, and consumed with the overwhelming silence that filled the room. She had never imagined herself here. A woman who had once worn her badge with pride, who had served her community with integrity, now found herself standing over the man she had loved, dead by her own hand. The gravity of her actions was inescapable, yet in that moment, Jovar couldn't bring herself to move. She couldn't bring herself to leave the room, couldn't bring herself to face the consequences of what she had done. The sirens were the first sound to break through the stillness. The wail of police vehicles outside, growing louder and louder as they neared, was a grim reminder that everything was about to change. It wasn't long before officers flooded into the apartment, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion as they took in the scene before them. The sight of Terell's lifeless body, the gun still clutched in Jovar's trembling hands, was the last thing anyone expected. This wasn't the Jovar they knew, the competent, level-headed deputy who had risen through the ranks with such promise. This was something entirely different, something tragic, something that no one could have foreseen. Jovar didn't resist when they cuffed her. She didn't speak as they led her out of the apartment, her thoughts a jumbled mess of guilt, shame, and disbelief. Her mind raced as she was placed in the back of the squad car, the reality of her situation beginning to set in. She had killed Terell. She had taken the life of the man she had loved, the father of her unborn child, and now there was no turning back. In the days that followed, Jovar's world crumbled around her. The media swarmed, their cameras flashing relentlessly as they descended on the case. Headlines blared, pregnant deputy kills boyfriend after abandonment, officer faces murder charges after fatal confrontation. The public was split. Some saw her as a tragic figure, a woman pushed to the brink by the emotional and psychological toll of her relationship. Others saw her as a murderer, a woman who had let her emotions cloud her judgment and take a life. No one, it seemed, could understand what had truly happened in that apartment. The circumstances were too complicated, the motives too layered for any simple answer. Jovar's trial was a spectacle. Inside the courtroom, her former colleagues and friends sat in the audience, their faces a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. They had watched her grow, had seen her excel in her career, and now, they were watching the unraveling of a woman they once admired. The trial was a painful reminder of everything Jovar had lost, her career, her future, and the life she had once hoped to build. Her defense team argued that she had acted in self-defense, that Terell's actions had escalated to a point where she feared for her life. They painted a picture of a woman trapped in an abusive relationship, one where she had been emotionally manipulated and betrayed at every turn. They argued that her judgment had been clouded by the overwhelming emotional strain of the past months, her pregnancy, Terell's infidelity, and the mounting pressure from both her professional and personal lives. But the prosecution was equally determined to prove that Jovar had acted out of revenge, not self-defense. They presented evidence of her emotional turmoil, but they also pointed to the cold, calculated nature of the shooting. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign that Terell had posed an immediate threat to her life. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who had been pushed to her breaking point, but who had chosen to act out of rage and betrayal, using the gun as a means of control when she felt she had lost everything. In the weeks that followed, witnesses came forward. Her colleagues from the sheriff's office testified, painting a picture of a woman who had once been a rising star in law enforcement, but who had slowly descended into chaos. They spoke of her emotional distress, her erratic behavior in the months leading up to the shooting, and the rumors about her relationship with Terell. They spoke of the reprimands, the internal investigations, and the growing concerns about her ability to remain impartial and professional while entangled in such a toxic relationship. But perhaps the most damning testimony came from the experts, the psychologists who were brought in to examine Jovar's mental state. They testified that Jovar had been suffering from severe emotional distress, that she had been struggling with deep feelings of betrayal and abandonment. They spoke of the emotional manipulation Terell had subjected her to, and how his actions had taken a toll on her mental health. But despite this, they also made it clear that she had not been in immediate danger when she shot him. The final verdict was a gut-wrenching moment for everyone involved. The jury deliberated for hours, torn between sympathy for the woman who had once been a respected deputy, and the undeniable fact that she had taken a life. The emotional evidence was powerful, but the legal evidence was equally compelling. In the end, the jury found Jovar guilty of second-degree murder. The judge, while acknowledging the emotional and psychological toll the situation had taken on her, handed down a sentence of life in prison. The courtroom was quiet as the sentence was read. Jovar's face remained expressionless, but inside, her heart shattered. Her world had collapsed in that moment. The life she had built, the career she had fought for, and the future she had once envisioned, all of it was gone. She was no longer the deputy, the dedicated officer, the woman who had once believed in second chances. Now, she was just another inmate, locked away in a cell with nothing but the weight of her actions and the loss of everything she had ever known. Outside the courtroom, the world continued on as if nothing had changed. But for Jovar, everything had changed. Her choices, her mistakes, her sacrifices, each one had led her to this moment. And now, as she was led away in handcuffs, she was left to face the haunting reality of the path she had chosen, a path that had led her from the promise of a bright future to the cold, lonely walls of a prison cell.